This is
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod, a podcast
RedPubPod.
from Redhawk Publications.
RedPubPod.
You nailed it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and regardless of when you're listening to this newest edition of RedPubPod, we thank you for listening. Normally we have Robert Knipe, our fearless publisher, say these words, and I miss him dreadfully. But today he's not here because he's paying authors royalties. So that's a good reason for him not
That's
to
a
be
good
here.
thing, yes, it is. Yeah.
Keeping him busy.
All the authors want that.
Oh, yeah. Today in the studio, we have our fearless engineer and program director, Richard Eller.
Yay.
And, of course, myself, Patty Thompson. Of course, and Robert calls me the Queen of Snark, but really I'm just the acquisition editor with a heart of gold. And today, I'd like to introduce our featured author and our guest, poet, author, Ken Harbert. Hey, Ken.
Hey, thank you. So nice to be here.
Welcome to RedPubPod.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
You know what, Ken? As I was kind of preparing for this pod, I kind of went through the files to figure out what exactly did we hear from you, get you on our radar. And from what I can tell, I believe our first discussion or getting together was actually about a year ago, because I saw my file was created in September of 2022. So that puts us at about the 12 to 13 month. But an important question I have for you is, how did you find us?
Well, I've seen a number of your books locally in Hickory, and also I heard about you, and of course, having a research background too, I researched a little bit, and I've always been interested in the community college here, simply because I graduated from a community college a few thousand years ago, and I was amazed when I heard that you actually had a really firm publishing company, and you had produced so many different things in so many different varieties that I felt like I had to come over and meet you.
That's awesome. And I should point out, when we talked, I remember, and I know we'll get into this, but with your healthcare background, you had mentioned things that you might want to do with your healthcare writing, but more importantly, I heard you mention something about poetry, and we kind of went in that direction, which leads us to the publication of your book entitled Our Paths in Life, Poems by Ken Harbert. Of course, you can buy that on redhawkpublications.com. And it's been quite a journey. How did you enjoy the process or hate the process of going through your poems and getting them published?
I really found it interesting and insightful because I've been writing poetry, I think, ever since I came back from the service when I was overseas about 50 years ago. And some of those poems are good, bad, and relate different phases of not only my life, but people I've known and places that I've been. And it was interesting to be able to, once again, not only review them, sometimes rewrite them, but also I'm a visual writer, so when I write, I see things. And to me, it was a wonderful trip. It was just not only down memory lane for the good parts, but also realizing some of the bad parts, but understanding that my feelings, my thoughts, my words kind of relate how I feel about things and who I've met and some of the wonderful people I've been in contact with in my life and in different places of the world and have seen things in different places of the world, and they all brought to me a vision, and then that went on paper, so that's how that came about.
And I will say, and I think this is important for listeners to know, sometimes poets will talk about what they know, what they see. I find your particular poetry collection to be about the journey of your life, and it really is, and hence the title, Our Paths in Life. I think it will be interesting for our listeners to know a little bit about your background, because, of course, that has a lot of bearing on your journey, which is unique. Would you mind sharing with us where you're from and your background, your career path, if you will?
Well, that's I guess I used the title Our Paths in Life because my path has been very crooked and very different. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I wasn't a great high school student. I joined the service. I actually volunteered for the Navy. I went to college a little bit before that, and I joined the United States Navy. I became a Navy corpsman. I served in Vietnam. I came back from Vietnam. I went to a community college, much like this community college, which was wonderful. I had a phenomenal English literature professor, and she was the one that really got me to write feelings down and thoughts down, and that was the beginning of my real writing. I went from there to nursing school, of all things, and then I left nursing school, and then I went to physician assistant school, and that was kind of part of my path. I'm a lifelong learner, and I think community college really embedded me with that, the idea that I could learn outside of a high school environment, that I could learn about what I really felt was important, and that was caring for people and taking care of people. I trained some of the first paramedics in the United States in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I went on to do more teaching. I taught when I was in the Marine Corps and the Navy. Then I went on to work in a number of different areas in medicine. As a physician assistant, I was able to start out in something I knew nothing about, which was psychiatry. I did that at the University of Pittsburgh, which really taught me about how people behave. I had a lot of experience in the service in trauma and emergency medicine, but I wanted to learn how people got there, how people became who they were, and how they did good things, bad things, or just bad things happened to them. And psychiatry helped me understand that and appreciate that. And I went on and got a master's degree while I was in the service, and then I ended up getting a PhD at Penn State University. And I chose medical education because that was the interest that I had at that time. I also worked on the trauma team. I worked in primary care. I worked in disaster medicine. I joined a medical reserve corps. I was involved in critical incident stress management. So I've done a lot of different things, both as a physician assistant and also as an officer in the military. So I was in the reserves for a long time, in the Coast Guard Reserves and in the public health. And that really helped me understand more about how we do care for people, but more importantly, how our healthcare system works.
So is psychology the link between medicine and poetry for you?
In some ways, yes, that's a very insightful thing. I think that psychology really taught me what cognitive or thinking is all about, the way we function, but then also the affective or how we feel is important. So we always think before we feel, in my mind. And I learned more about how we think than I had ever learned before when I was in psychology and psychiatry. And I had some incredible mentors in psychology, both in critical incident stress and also in debriefing and also in disaster medicine, which was crucial because unfortunately, I think we don't put enough emphasis into mental health simply because people are confused by what it really means and what it does and what it offers. And during a disaster or an emergency situation, a critical incident, it's very interesting and crucial and essential to make sure that people are stable and they understand they've gone through an experience that very few people go through, and they need to know how to come out on the other side of that. My team of people that I worked with went to 9/11. They were there for 3 months. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to New York because I was sick, but they did a phenomenal job. They were there for a couple of months by themselves as responders. They were law enforcement officers, paramedics, counselors, social workers, and physician assistants that were there offering counseling services to those people during 9/11. I was also involved in Katrina. And Katrina, I was with the Medical Reserve Corps. And there again, you see people at their worst, but you also see an amazing thing that people are resilient and they will survive. You need to help them. And I think that's important. But I go back to what you said. Yes, psychology really gave me insight to myself, how I feel, how I think, but more importantly, how I react to people. I think I always assumed that people acted the way they did without really having a better understanding of what's behind that or what's in front of that or how did that happen. Does that make sense?
And what about poetry? Is poetry therapeutic for you, or do you think it can be for people?
I think it's tremendously therapeutic. I mean, where did I start reading poetry? You know, I hate to say this, but in high school, you read poetry like Wadsworth and everything else. And I read Tennyson, and I love Tennyson, the Iliad especially. But the issue is I felt that I had to rhyme it. I had to have it had a certain approach, and I was never able to do that. And then when I was stationed in San Francisco, I met the people at the City of Lights and Lawrence Ferlinghetti's bookstore in San Francisco, and it was an aha because I realized that poetry is really what comes from inside, or what you're thinking about something, or what you're feeling about something, or what you see, or what you appreciate. So again, that connected with the psychological aspects of what you mentioned and how I kind of have a worldview. And I find that when I write, the nicest thing that I hear from some people is, wow, I really like that because I know what that means. I know how that feels. I've been there. And to me, that's an incredible feeling. I mean, amazing feeling in a lot of ways, because that means there's someone else out there that understands my words. And to me, my poetry are words that are inside me and around me and come through me.
So it sounds like poetry is a way that you can express things in a way that you can't express. I mean, there is no other way to express it because it gets to something very, very basic for you and for other people who read it.
That's true. And as I mentioned before, I think it's weird that I visualize. I mean, I've talked to musicians, and they talk to me about visualizing their notes and what they're writing. And I actually, I mean, I'll be talking to you, I find out more about you, and all of a sudden I'm kind of seeing words that really mean who you are or how our interaction or an aha that you gave me that I'd never thought about. And those are words that I end up writing. And sometimes I'll be writing, and I'm sure other poets do this, I'll be writing down the road and I'll go, wow, you know. I mean, yesterday I heard a Simon and Garfunkel song that took me back to living in California and San Francisco, and I had to stop the car and write a few notes because it was that memory that brought back some other thoughts about other folks. That makes sense.
It's funny you should say that. This past weekend, Redhawk Publications, located at Hickory, North Carolina, as a part of Catawba Valley Community College. This past weekend, we had a book fair, and we had a number of our authors that were represented, and one of which was Scott Owens, who we've published, and he's a prolific poet. He was writing a poem at the book fair. And I saw him actually, he had a tagline that he heard somebody say something, and he wrote it down, and I saw him writing a poem.
Because it can come at the funniest times, right? I mean, not the most convenient times, let's put it that way.
Yes, and I think, I mean, in my profession, I've written a lot of professional articles, a few chapters in textbooks, a few textbooks, et cetera, and that's something that's not spontaneous. That is something that you really need to have a timeline and you really know, go for it. I've never been that way with my poetry. My poetry is exactly what you're expressing. It comes to me in different ways. And as you know, as we're talking about, as Patty mentioned too, it might just be something that somebody says that clicks in my brain cells, which helps me get a little meaning for something different. I used to love a Japanese poet by the name of Bao, and you know, Leonard Cohen, I realize I think is a lot like that. A lot of his poetry that he wrote, he kind of took from other situations in his life and about people that he knew and he met. And I find that in a lot of songs that I love. I love, people like, Simon and Garfunkel, Gordon Lightfoot. Harry Chapin, I think, was a troubadour, incredible. And I saw him in concert once, and I mean, his words to me made me see visions. And I've always wondered, how did he do that? How did he come up with that? How did he find that expression or that experience or those thoughts? And sometimes, and again, I would tell everybody that we all write and we all keep journals and we all write little notes, and they mean a lot. And sometimes we don't realize what they mean until we go back and read them.
And if we don't, we let them flit away, and we may never get those back.
That is so, what you just said is so true. It's like, I can't tell you how many poems I've thought of that have floated away, and I thought, I should have written that down. It's amazing how our minds work and how our brains work. I've worked with a lot of people who have trauma and trauma events and post-traumatic stress disorders and traumatic brain injuries, and you realize that the mind is an amazing thing, but at the same time, there are a lot of things happening up there that we're not aware of, and there's a lot of blockages and there's a lot of openings. It just depends on how open we are to things and how that information goes in and comes out through our limbing system.
There's a question that pops into my mind thinking about the book fair this past weekend. The gift of writing to heal, or at least help the healing process. You were near a gentleman who represented the veterans. We had a group of North Carolina veterans that put together an anthology of sorts, and it's called Brothers and Sisters Like These.
Brothers and Sisters Like These, yeah.
Yeah, and I believe that collective, that group that gets together of the veterans in our state, that book becomes a cathartic experience of writing. We also had Exodus House there, and we helped some of their residents, they're always in recovery, but it's post-addiction. They did a collection of books, and it helps them, again, getting those words on paper. It doesn't have to be a poem. Anything that helps you try to heal through words. Is that something you would have recommended or have recommended to your patients to journal, to write? Is that something?
Of course. I mean, in speaking about traumatic events or trauma, that's one of the first things. If you look at cognitive behavioral therapy or the idea of what is your self-talk, what is your thinking really lean you to, that's one of the most important things, I think, for anybody who's going through any issues or problems or any recovery. If you look at veterans' poetry, my favorite were Wilfred Owens, who wrote poetry back in World War I, Sigfrid Sassoon, who wrote poetry way back in World War I. These men and women today have written so many incredible things. One friend of mine, Linda Vandevander, who's no longer with us, who was one of the first Vietnam nurses to really write about her experiences in the war. That was tremendously cathartic for her because she was able to put everything down on paper in her book, Home Before Morning, which was really about her experiences, good and bad and ugly. And it helped her a lot to move into a therapeutic kind of environment. So I agree with you 100%. And I only wish, as Richard was pointing out, that I had written more because there were times when I think I could have reached a little deeper. If that makes sense?
Absolutely.
But what's fascinating about you is I coming into this, I was thinking that as a PA and writing poetry, those are two we think of them as being very, very separate enterprises. But the way you've described it's a fluid thing back and forth between the two, right? I mean, much more so than I would have ever considered.
Well, very few people really look in depth, and the name physician assistant is kind of misleading because, and I say this as both an educator and a clinician, we're trained in a medical model. A lot of medical schools today are 3 years long. That's undergraduate medical education. And most PA programs are 2.5 years long. And that educational format is formed on a curriculum similar to what medical school's like. And most of our PAs in the United States are trained to communicate better with patients. And that's something we learned from day one. And that means not using medical terms that really try to be patient-centered. You know, Carl Rogers talked about that 1,000 years ago, about the true nature of walking in someone else's moccasins, understanding what's that patient going through, rather than assuming they're just a disease, find out more about them. And PA physician assistants in the United States take behavioral medicine. They have to take a clinical rotation where they do behavioral medicine or psychiatry or not psychology, psychiatry or behavioral medicine. And so you do get an insight into how people think, how people act, how mental illness affects people and how they relate to it, and how you can help them. And it's not just about, there's lots of drugs out there. It's not just about pharmacology. It's about having someone who can guide you, which is, again, our paths in life. I owe my experiences and my being here today talking to you to a lot of people who were able to say, hey, think about this, think about that, do this. Why don't you go ahead and get a master's? Why don't you go ahead and get a doctorate? Why don't you think about working in this field versus that field? I was a hospitalist for a while, and basically an opportunity came up for me to get in academia, and I grabbed that, and it was a life-changing experience, because as a lifelong learner, I felt if I can help somebody else, that's even better. And one of the things I feel good about is one college allowed me to start a vet up program. So I had a bridging program for people who were medics and corpsmen in the military, much like I was, and then they could go on and become PAs, and then they could go on and take care of others. And that, to me, was a legacy for me. It was very important in my life, and I never thought I could do that. I never thought I would have that opportunity until I found one school that allowed me to do that. It was just the idea that they said, yeah, it's a great idea. Why don't you try that?
What school was that? I'm just curious.
It was South College in Tennessee,
Wow.
And they have a number of PA programs now. And the president there gave me the opportunity to try that, which was a little bit out of the ordinary, because we were able to start a bridge for men and women who were veterans to go on and become physician assistants.
And I think that was the thing I remembered when I first met you. It was my aha moment, because I love my PAs and my NPs. I just do. They spend more time with me, quality time, and I have a relationship with them that I've never had with MDs. But that said, I recall you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, had it not been for the medic corps, we would not have a physician's assistant as we know it, because these men and women were coming back from the war, Vietnam, and they had these significant training in healthcare, but there was nothing they could do. They weren't quite nurses, they weren't quite doctors, but they were darn well equipped. And it was because of you, Ken, that you created a pathway for those medic corps folks to now have a career that's now open to anybody, not just folks from the military services. So thank you.
Well, listen, I'm just one of many. There are a lot of people out there who did similar kind of things, and I look back in the 70s and the 80s, and there were a lot of Vietnam veterans, men and women, who became physician assistants, who had taken care of a lot of individuals in a lot of different ways. Dr. Richard Smith, an Afro-American at University of Washington in Northwest, started his medics program, or a PA program, with ex-Special Forces military personnel who did wonderful jobs. They spent, some of those graduates spent 35 years working with the same physician in the rural parts of the Northwest. Dr. Gene Stead started the first PA program at Duke University with 3 ex-Navy corpsmen. And that led to a pipeline that allowed a lot of other veterans to go. I think that's one of the things we're missing today. I would love to see medical schools, nurse practitioner schools, PA programs create that kind of bridge, that pathway that would allow medics, corpsmen, men, and an enormous amount of women to be able to continue their education and provide care. And there's no one better than those individuals who want to take care of somebody. They're compassionate, they understand the worst of the worst, and they're willing to learn more.
And here we had a PA program for a short period of time at the community college level that I thought made a lot of sense, but for whatever reason, it didn't stay.
Well, the interesting thing is we like nurse practitioners. I've also been involved with nurse practitioners, and I want to say they're phenomenal too. And so are physicians. I've trained PAs, NPs, and MDs and DOs. So I feel I can say that there's not one field out there better than another. Physicians, MDs, and DOs, they spend a lot longer in their education, plus their internship and their residency, or the residency these days. NPs and PAs do not spend that much longer in residencies. But to go back to what you said, degree creep came into play. And basically when PAs first started, their programs for a certificate, nurse practitioner programs were not graduate programs, and slowly it became baccalaureate programs and graduate programs. Now everybody is kind of moving toward doctorates of nurse practitioner, doctorates of medical science for PAs. So it's just the way things have turned out, and it's just that kind of advance, again, because not only science has changed, but also medical education has changed.
Interesting.
But that doesn't mean, by the way, that this program, community college program, was any different than any other program out there. It just meant that the careers had changed. Today, there are still programs that were based on community colleges. Essex Community College in Baltimore was a community college, and now is combined with a master's program, so they get an associate degree, then they go on and get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. It's a nice pipeline.
I actually saw one of I guess he's grandfathered, a Catawba Valley Community College PA from way back in the day. He got his 2-year degree, and he is a PA. And you don't find those anymore. But it was interesting that he was so proud of what he got here, and he introduced me to 2 others that I've since met. So yeah, we have an interesting legacy right here at our community college of what we were able to do, and some of those PAs are still around and practicing.
We produced a few unicorns.
Yeah.
People that you don't have
Got to
anymore.
watch out for the unicorns because they still have to pass national boards, and I know 2 of those people, and they've done a phenomenal job in their careers.
That's awesome.
That's great.
And let's not forget, Ken is a poet, and I'm going to ask you to read a poem, Ken. Usually doesn't take us this long to get into having. No, because this has all been really fascinating, and I know not only is this going to appeal to our listeners who like to hear our authors, but I have a feeling we're going to get some healthcare and medical care folks that are going to listen to this because they're going to maybe tune into the poetry that's inside themselves. So I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, read a poem that's maybe your favorite or something that people have asked you to explain or it resonates with your readers. Is there anything there that you might want to read?
If it's okay with you, I'd like to read 2.
Please do.
Both of these are important to me. This one is called He Keeps on Trying. He gave up trying when he watched his grandmother die in an oxygen tent within the crowded living tomb of a poor hospital ward. He gave up trying when his mother died after her 3rd heart operation. He gave up trying when he listened to his brother's final change strokes breathing, ending his struggle with AIDS. He gave up trying to surrender himself with the peacefulness of knowing and accepting a higher power. He gave up trying to remember the intensity of spiritualness, openness, of innocence he held once as a young older boy filled with hope and belief. He gave up trying to focus on the centered calmness of self he found alone so high in the clear, clean Rocky Mountains of the 1970s. He gave up trying to understand the loss of friends and family he suffered through human tragedy, war, disease, stress, and lack of hope. He keeps on trying to find and be the humanist He feels deep down in his inner soul. He keeps on trying. God keeps on laughing.
All about accepting the things that we cannot know.
And I'd like to read one other, if I may.
Please do.
And I'd like to just dedicate this to all those veterans out there who aren't with us today. Will you remember my name? Will you remember my name or just my loss? Your brother, sister, father, son, lover. I was there for you, for country, for others. Doing what I could, never perfect, being the best that I could be. Will you remember my name? Have you said it out loud lately? Does my picture sit on the nightstand? Don't worry, I'm always there. Will you remember my name? Laughing, loving, happy, and full of life, knowing you were the life of my life. Will you remember my name? So think of my service to you, to others, to my mates. Let that thought linger just for a while, today and tomorrow. Just remember my name.
It's powerful.
That's very powerful.
I wrote that after going to a funeral for a friend of mine. It was just very powerful for me because I hadn't heard his name in a while, and it was like, you know, what happens to people that we've lost? Have we ever really mentioned their name? And I think that's important. Can I read one more?
I wish you would. Thank you.
This is also important to me. It's called The Art of Medicine. My art is medicine. My business is caring. Many start it. Many find its science, forgetting about its people. Only a few get its true art. It's more than just caring. It's more than doing. It's being in the patient's moment. Carl Rogers called it centered. Some get it, some never will. They try, they fail. They just do the job. Never being an active participant in caring. Service, not advocacy. Forgetting it's not for them, but it's always been an art. People care.
That clocks it. That clocks it pretty good.
It really does.
Now, let me ask you, you were talking about pulling over and writing down some stuff. How do you write? Do you write by inspiration, or do you sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do something today, or do you take that inspiration you got when you pulled off the road and wrote it down, and then at a designated time finish it up? How does that work? Or does it work by any specific means? Is it different every time?
I think that's a really good question. I think for me, it's a little different. I've always carried a notebook, not a journal, a notebook. Either professionally when you're in clinical medicine. Now today we all have computers and we always do things. But I got so used to, before we had computers, to carry a notebook for things I'd never seen or patients I came in contact with that I wanted to learn more about, or when I was doing rounds with a physician or with a group of physicians or a group of providers, you'd hear something, you'd write it down, and you'd want to know more about it. So today I do kind of the same thing, only it's about poetry. I carry a very small book that I carry everywhere I go. And even on planes or wherever, I'll write something down that just hits me or strikes me or that I see or someone that I met or someplace that I go to. Recently I went back to Pittsburgh and wrote a poem on top of a mountain just looking down at the city. And I wrote a couple of words, and I'll go back, and I'll just add some more words and some more words. And that's how things come to me. It starts with a small visual in my mind, and then I keep writing on it and adding to it.
So is that how the poems from your current book came about?
And if you don't mind, I'm going to add to that one. How old would you say some of the oldest poems are in this collection?
The oldest poems were written in the 70s when I came back from Vietnam. Some of those express some sadness and express some loss and express the adjustment, I think, that every veteran goes through. It doesn't matter if it's Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever. And you read it in World War II, you read it in Korea. All of us, when we come back to this world, back in the world, we try to adjust because we've been in a different place, in a different era, in a different way, surrounded by a different environment. Sometimes our heads are on swivels. Sometimes we don't know if we're safe or secure. And that's 24/7. That just doesn't happen 5 or 6 hours. So when you come back, you have that issue of adjustment. For some people, they can't get through that adjustment, and it goes on and causes other problems. Post-traumatic stress maybe, or stress that later leads to other problems. But for me, these poems date back probably to the 70s, some of them, and they traveled with me through my path, through my life, and meeting people and going places. I had the opportunity to sail halfway around the world once with the United States Coast Guard, and I wrote a lot of poems about different kinds of places, South America, Asia, and other places. And, it's just, you get off a plane in a strange place and you go, wow. You go to a place like Laos or Vietnam and you go, holy mackerel. It's just amazing because you've never seen that. Your worldview changes.
This isn't Pittsburgh anymore.
This isn't Pittsburgh anymore. And that's the amazing thing about life. I think we all have those experiences. And, Patty, even going back to Pittsburgh last week, it's not Pittsburgh anymore either. There were a lot of changes.
Fair enough.
I went back for my high school reunion, and it was like, where do all these old people come from? And then I looked in the mirror and I went, well, I'm probably one of them. So, I find it's always amazing to encounter new things, and I hope that I always will be able to.
And some things change like that, but then, like you were talking about with post-traumatic stress, some of those things stay the same because your experience after Vietnam is no different than World War II or World War I, or even farther back than that if you go back to the Civil War or Revolutionary War. Yeah.
Well, it's different. I would just say, not to correct you, but just to say it's different in a lot of ways, in that currently the wars that we fight today, Iraq, Afghanistan, what these men and women went through, number one, there are more women in combat than we've ever had in our lives before, and very few people appreciate what they've added to the whole task. And our military does some amazing things. I think they're in over 100 countries today serving in different ways. And they bring back that whole global worldview rather than just one worldview. Kind of much like World War II, where people experienced 4 or 5 continuous years in different places. Today, it's not uncommon to meet somebody who's in an active unit who might do 10 or 15 deployments. And that means it's not like Vietnam where you spent a year or 2 years. These folks were there ongoing or in different places. They come back for 4 months, go back for 4 months, go back for a year, whatever. So it's a little bit different than that. And it's, I think, a little more difficult to adjust to what living in New Jersey or Hickory, North Carolina, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's a different. You come back and it's a different environment. It's a different feel, if that makes sense. And you're a different person. In a way, that's probably the biggest key. Even if you don't have PTSD, you're still going to be a different person. You've experienced different things. You've experienced things that very few people in life have experienced. And you have a different outlook on what life is really all about, and also how short life is. And that's something that most people don't understand. Most people have a sense of entitlement that this is our life, I'm going to live to be this age, everything's okay, without realizing that it could end in a second.
It makes it a smaller world, too. When, we are blessed and privileged to be Americans, but hey, if you're stationed in South Korea or Germany, if you're going to be going to Ukraine for whatever peacekeeping and war efforts, you come back and have a better appreciation for what we have here. But you also understand that there's so many more commonalities between people. It doesn't matter. Different cultures, yes, but we're all humans. So I appreciate what the service has done for many people who have come from smaller communities. They go outside the country, they come back, and they see it is a small world.
And I remember the draft when I was in, and I volunteered. I wasn't drafted, but if you look back at people who were required to do service, that was an important thing to a lot of people, because you met people in Vietnam, you met people who were college graduates, you meet people who didn't get through high school. You met so many diverse people. You got to know a different brotherhood, a different sisterhood of different diverse, inclusive people that is so totally different in some ways today in general society. In the military, it's still the same. You serve with a group of people, and forever and ever, you don't lose them. You might not see them for 20 years, 10 years, or whatever, but you still know who they are, and they still know who you are.
And we need to remember their names.
Yeah, you still remember their names.
We could go on forever. Ken, you're one of the more fascinating guests we've had, in addition to the poet in you. Your career path, which really has touched many lives, and we thank you for not only your service, but what you've done for the medical community as well. Thank you. I'd like to just kind of point out that the name of the book, again, is Our Paths in Lives.
Available at RedHawkPublications.com.
Thank you. You did that very well. Thank you. And in addition, Ken has a few different writing events coming up, so I'd like to help publicize that for him. Ken's going to be doing a book signing and reading October 14th, 2023, just in case you're listening to this next year. And that's going to be a reading at Tybrisa Books in Lenoir, North Carolina. So we encourage you, October 14th, if you're around from 11 to 3, he'll be at Tybrisa Books. And in addition, for all of our Hickory and Catawba County folks, Ken is also going to be at the Hickory Patrick Beaver Memorial Library. He'll be doing a reading and signing on November 7th at 6 p.m. at the Patrick Beaver Library. So again, come on out for that. And here's a last one that I thought was pretty interesting. November 11th, from 5 to 6, you'll be doing a poetry reading and signing at the Veterans Memorial Garden at the Stead Center in Durham, North Carolina. So again, these will all be on the description of this podcast so that you can not only get his book, but also hear about these activities if you hear this soon. And so just want to thank you so much for being our guest today, Ken.
It's been a privilege and it's an honor. And I really want to thank Redhawk, because I've carried these poems for a long time, and it's so wonderful to see them in a book and be able to share them with family and friends. And a couple of these poems about my family, so that even means more to me. I dedicated this to my granddaughter and grandson, and that means so much to me, seeing as how that they're the future for all of us. So thank you.
No problem. Again, on behalf of RedPubPod, we want to thank you for listening. Please make sure that you check out our website, again, RedHawkPublications.com. We encourage you to like, share, and subscribe. And I think that's it. Richard, got anything?
Just one more thing. We have a rather tricky name to this podcast, RedPubPod, but could you say that one time for us?
RedPubPod.
Oh, he did it.
You nailed it.
Nailed it.
I'm not sure I can say that real fast. But
Can you do it 7 times real fast?
I don't think so.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We appreciate you being a part of our podcast. Come check us out, all the 130 plus some books that we have, but we're very proud and very honored that Ken Harbert is one of our authors, and we invite you to come and read more than he was able to present today, because there's so much more in this book, Our Paths in Life. Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been
RedPubPod. RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
a podcast
RedPubPod.
from Redhawk Publications.
RedPubPod.